So today we are reading a story called Roger's Choice. And everyone look at me. Everyone look at me. So today we are reading a story called Roger's Choice. And it is about a boy and his sister that they live with just their mom. And their mom's not doing great. And they don't have a lot of money, and they don't have any food in the house. And so it's going and it's looking at what Roger does to try to help take care of his sister and his mom and himself, and some difficult choices he has to make. So that's why it's called Roger's Choice. Okay? So some of you might earn money at home or from family or from neighbors. Raise your hand if you ever do chores or do something extra to earn a little money. When I was younger, when I was your age, I would dust my grandma's house. I'd help clean her house, and she would pay me. And that's how I earned some money. Okay? So, but there are other ways. In the fall, you can rake leaves for people. You can mow grass in the summer if you're big and old enough, right? If you're big enough and old enough. In the winter, you can shovel snow. You guys can do chores. Like I said, I dusted my grandma's house. She couldn't get down and dust all of her shelves and everything, so I would do it. And things like that. There's lots of ways we can earn money, right? That don't necessarily mean going out and getting a job, right? You are doing a job, but you're not going to a store and getting a job, right? So, think about this. If you were faced with some of the choices that we're going to see Roger go through, where he needs to get food for his sister and himself, and maybe even his mom, because his mom, we'll find out, won't leave her room. Like, she won't get out and help take care of him and his sister, okay? So, he's older than the sister, and so he's like, I need to help take care of her, right? So, I don't want answers right now, but I want you to think, if that was you, if you were taking care of your little sibling, and you need to make sure that they ate that day, how could you, and you had no food in the house, how could you get food? It kind of goes back to when we read the Boxcar Children, right? Henry went out and would go and do odd jobs for people and get money until he found the doctor, right? So, he knew he needed to provide for his family and his siblings, and while the girls found safe things to eat in the forest, he would go out and get enough money for bread and milk and sometimes some meat, right? So think. I don't want you to answer, but I want you to think. Would it be that easy to go out and do? No, especially nowadays, right? It's a lot different than it was years ago or even just a few years ago to just be able to go out and do stuff, because it's not always that safe to do that, right? It's not always safe to just walk down the road to a store by yourself with your sister, right? So things have changed, but think, if it were safe, how would you go about it? And since it's not always safe, what can you do instead? Make sense? So let's look at page 80 and follow along with me, okay? Roger felt 2 candy bars under his shirt. Slowly, he walked to the counter to pay for his root beer. He jingled the change in his hand and tried to whistle a little tune. His throat was dry and the cheery notes seemed to stick. That all you want? Mr. Bradley asked. He had a big jolly face when he smiled, his dimples looked like big holes in his cheeks. Yes, sir, that's it. Can't get over how much you've grown, Roger. 2 feet at least, huh? Mr. Bradley's big hand ruffled Roger's hair before it took the change. He counted it and dropped it into the cash register. Mopping his forehead with his big white handkerchief, Mr. Bradley turned back toward Roger. Say hello to that little sister of yours for me, Roger. Yes, sir. See you around, Mr. Bradley. Roger went to the front of the store and used the bottle opener, tipping the bottle upside down and to let the cold, fizzy liquid run down his throat. So, he had 2 candy bars where, Bella? Under his shirt. And what did he pay for? Charisma? The root beer. So what did he do with the candy bars, Lincoln? He snuck them or he stole them, right? So he stole 2 candy bars. But Mr. Bradley knows Roger, right? And says, say hi to your sister and stuff. So it's someone he knows, but he still stole from Mr. Bradley's store, right? So let's see what happens next. Roger stopped outside to bend over and tie his sneaker and then ran down the street. As soon as he rounded the corner, he took the 2 candy bars from under his shirt. They were beginning to melt. Then he ran the 3 blocks to his home. Wendy, Roger's whisper broke a quick scamper of little feet down the hall. Wendy was still in her long, thin nightgown. Her hair was tangled and dirty. Hi, Roger. Did you bring me some candy? Wendy ran forward and clung to Roger's hand. She took her candy bar and smiled up at him. Yeah, kiddo. Where's Mom? Sleeping still, Wendy said, her mouth full of the melting chocolate. Listen, Wendy, I want you to comb your hair and get on some decent clothing. We're going for a walk, Roger said quietly. He went to the bare room that he called his own and flung himself down onto the thin mattress. He punched the flat foam pillow in frustration. It had been 2 days since his mother had been out of bed, and it wasn't the first time she had stayed in bed for so long either. After Roger's dad had left, his mother had cried a lot. She stopped taking Roger and Wendy to Sunday school. Lots of times she stayed in bed for 2, 3, maybe even 4 days at a time. Roger was sick of the makeshift meals he and Wendy were forced to eat. Makeshift means it's not a full meal, okay? And it's not really stuff that would typically go together. Think of like Elf. How many of you, just show your hands, have seen Elf, the movie, the Christmas movie? So in Elf, he makes spaghetti, right? But he puts Pop-Tarts and maple syrup and candy and stuff on it, right? So it's kind of not what we would consider a normal meal, right? Does that make sense? So that's kind of what a makeshift meal is, okay? But he liked it like that on Elf, right? A lot of times if you're making a makeshift meal, it might not even necessarily be things you like, but it's stuff that you have that you can put together to at least make something for you to eat. Make sense? So in this sense, it's not, oh, we're experimenting and making some candy for dinner meal. It's, this is what we have, this is what we afford, this is what we can put together. Make sense? When everything in the apartment had been eaten, he had used the last of the money in his bank. There wasn't much there, and Wendy needed more than a few candy bars from Mr. Bradley's store. He wanted the Lord to show him what to do, but somehow when Roger prayed these days, he felt as if his prayers didn't go very far. The Lord didn't seem to even hear. Raise your hand if you've had those moments where you pray really hard about something and you feel like God's not answering it or God's not hearing what you're asking. Is it true that God's not hearing what you're asking? No. But sometimes it feels like that, and sometimes we get so upset that things aren't going exactly how we wanted in that moment that we start to believe that. Does that make sense? And so that's what Roger's feeling right now. Ready, Roger? Wendy came to the open doorway in a faded skirt and a bright red t-shirt. Her hair was twisted into a ponytail that looked terrible, but Roger didn't feel like worrying about his sister's appearance. Okay, Wendy, out the door. Roger jumped from the mattress. Where are we going? Wendy asked as they left the front steps. She had to skip every 3 steps to keep up with Roger. Oh, I don't know, he answered without looking at her. I want something to eat. Well, there's no money. So? Wendy, you just can't get food without money. Roger raised his voice and gave her arm a little jerk. Ouch. Look, I'm sorry. Just don't talk for a few minutes. I'm thinking about how to get something to eat. Roger knew he couldn't get a job. No one hired an 11-year-old boy. He walked slowly down the street. It was hot, really hot. They weren't far from Mr. Bradley's store when Roger decided to go back for some more candy. He turned into the parking lot, pulling Wendy behind him. Listen, Wendy, I want you to wait outside for me. You sit down on the sidewalk and no noise. He showed her where to sit and walked into the store. Roger decided that he would just wait near the candy until he could be sure no one was looking. He couldn't stop the thumping of his heart. He seemed to be pounding right out of his chest and ears. The worst part about taking the candy was that Wendy would know. She wasn't too young to know that there was a way to get things without money. She would know that her big brother was a thief. Roger didn't want Wendy to know, but he also didn't want her to be hungry. When he was sure no one was paying any attention to him, he sucked in his breath and reached for the big chocolate bar. Without even looking around, he quickly slid it under his shirt. Roger! Roger jumped and whirled around. Wendy was standing there, calmly eating a popcorn ball. Where did you get that? Why aren't you back where I told you to sit? Nobody told you to come in. Roger angrily shoved Wendy backward. He had thought for sure he'd been caught. He could see his mother's face with tears in her eyes as she came to pick him up at the police station. Way in the back of his mind, he could hear his Sunday school teacher telling him how God hated stealing. Tears sprang into Wendy's eyes, and Roger immediately felt sorry. He hadn't meant to yell. Mr. Bradley gave it to me, Wendy sniffed. He told me to come inside out of the hot sun. He gave me some lemonade, too. Roger looked across the store. Several customers were waiting at Mr. Bradley's cash register. He looked pretty hot and tired. Twice while Roger was watching, he wiped his forehead and neck with a big white handkerchief. Listen, kiddo, you go back and tell Mr. Bradley thank you, and I'll be right there with you, Roger said gently. As soon as she turned around, he pulled the chocolate bar out from under his shirt and put it carefully back onto the shelf. He looked back at Mr. Bradley, punching buttons on the cash register. His big, jolly face was sweaty. Suddenly, it seemed that the Lord gave Roger an idea. He walked over to the cash register and picked up a paper bag. He reached over and started putting groceries into it. Need a hand, Mr. Bradley? Mr. Bradley frowned and began to shake his head. Roger, I can't hire you. I don't make enough to have help. I've told you that before. Not even for a package of hot dogs and maybe some bread and peanut butter? Roger asked. He continued placing groceries in the paper bag. A slow smile spread across Mr. Bradley's face. He mopped his forehead again and nodded. Okay, boy, you got yourself a deal. So is Mr. Bradley going to be paying Roger? No, he's going to be giving him bread, hot dogs, and peanut butter so that way, even though he's not getting money, he's still getting food, right? So he's getting a good deal for what he's doing. Roger felt like singing almost. Just as the Lord had told him to start helping Mr. Bradley, he knew that the Lord was telling him something else now. He felt his whole face get hot. But he knew what he had to do. He watched the last customer in line pay for his groceries and walk out the door. Mr. Bradley? Roger felt his voice squeak a little. Mr. Bradley, please forgive me. I've stolen some candy bars, but I want to pay for them now. I'll work for them. I'm really sorry. The Lord hasn't listened to my prayers ever since I did it. Wendy was so hungry, Mr. Bradley, but it was wrong. Embarrassed, Roger realized that tears were streaming down his cheeks. Mr. Bradley wasn't smiling. It's a serious thing, stealing is, he said, looking down. It cost me a lot of money. He mopped his forehead again, slowly this time. But I forgive you, Roger, he said. I know you know the Lord, and he can give you the strength never to steal again. Roger stood smiling, a quivering smile, while Wendy watched with big eyes. Mr. Bradley finally broke the silence. Well, boy, if you're going to earn your keep around here, you'd better get working. Here, he handed Roger a broom. This floor hasn't been swept in a month of Sundays. Those candy bars can be part of your pay. Oh, thank you, Mr. Bradley. Roger beamed at Wendy and began to sweep the floor with all his might. Wendy, you sit tight and watch Big Brother. When I'm done, I'll take you home, and we'll have the best supper ever. I bet Mom will smell cooking and get up and help eat it. Wendy looked up at Mr. Roger, and she had sticky popcorn all over her face, but her eyes were shining. As Roger swept, he watched a pile of dust gathering in the center of the floor and smiled. The dirt was like his sins, out in the open, not swept under the rug. He felt 10 feet tall. He knew he had made the right decision.